The new human girl arrived at school, and the dying student panicked the moment he smelled her. Imagine being the new girl in a small, freezing town in the middle of Oregon, walking into a brand new school, knowing absolutely no one, and suddenly noticing that the most beautiful and most distant boy in the entire class can't stop staring at you, with fear in his eyes. Theo Marval had learned to live with death. Every morning was a bitter miracle. Every day that passed was one less. He had stopped asking anything from fate. No love, no salvation, no hope. He had made peace with the end. Until Isabella Moren walked through the doors of Ashford Creek High School on a frost-covered Monday morning, and the air in that room changed completely. It wasn't the way she smiled at the class without a trace of fear. It wasn't those honey-colored eyes that took in everything with pure curiosity. It was her scent. That impossible fragrance that woke something inside Theo he believed had been dead for years. And at the same time, revealed a secret he never wanted to know. She is the only person in the world who can save him, and that is exactly why. He needs to stay away from her. But when the heart makes up its mind, no curse in the world is strong enough to stop it. This is forbidden love, drama, and mystery in a story that will keep you hooked from the very first second. Stay until the end. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see you in the comments. Monday always arrived in Ashford Creek with a kind of reluctant heaviness, as though even the weather couldn't quite commit to starting the week. The fog settled thick between the pines that bordered Route 7, the kind that swallowed headlights whole and turned familiar silhouettes into shapes that felt like memories rather than real things. By 7:45 in the morning, the parking lot of Ashford Creek High School was already glazed with frost, and the mountains beyond it had vanished behind a curtain of low cloud that had not moved in 3 days. Theo Marval arrived early, as he always did. He preferred the school before it filled with noise. The quiet corridors, the empty classroom, the particular quality of silence that existed in a building before it woke up. He slid into his seat by the second window, closest to the radiator, though warmth had become something he processed intellectually rather than felt. His hands were cold, as they had been for months. His bones carried a tiredness that sleep no longer touched. He dropped his backpack beside the desk and pulled out a worn copy of a Steinbeck novel he wasn't really reading, and he waited. Theo was 18, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to move carefully through the world, not from shyness, but from the quiet discipline of someone conserving energy he did not have to spare. His skin was pale, in the way that Pacific Northwest winters could make anyone pale, except that his carried a faint translucency, as though the light inside him was running low. His hair, dark as wet cedar bark, fell in loose waves across his forehead. His eyes, a shade between gray and blue that changed depending on the light, held the thoughtful weight of a person far older than his years. His classmates noticed him. Most of them, after a semester of receiving nothing but polite distance in return, had stopped trying to get closer. What none of them knew, what only his father, his Aunt Elena in Portland, and two quietly baffled specialists in Seattle knew, was that Theo had been living with a progressive cellular disorder for 3 years. His grandfather had died of the same condition at 34. His great-uncle hadn't made it past 30. The Marval family had carried it like a shadow for generations, a rare, undocumented failure in the body's ability to sustain itself at the cellular level, so unusual that it had no proper name in medical literature yet. One of the Seattle doctors had started calling it Marval regenerative syndrome in his private notes, a grim kind of immortality, having a disease named after your family. The condition caused progressive fatigue, circulatory weakness, and what that same doctor described carefully as a systemic decline in baseline vitality. In simpler terms, Theo's body was slowly and stubbornly forgetting how to maintain itself. He had spent the previous summer at various clinics. He had done the blood panels, the scans, the experimental infusion protocols that left him shaking for 2 days afterward. He had watched his father try to hold himself together in waiting rooms. He had listened to words like exploratory and palliative management and learned to nod at them without flinching. He had come back to Ashford Creek in September with the quiet certainty that he was running a clock he could not read, and he had decided, with a kind of brutal practicality, to stop waiting for a solution that wasn't coming. He went to school. He did his work. He read his Steinbeck. He did not let people in. His grandfather had told him a story once, when Theo was 12, and the old man was 59, and failing in the same way Theo was now beginning to fail. He told it the way old men from small towns tell things, half seriously, half as though testing whether the listener was paying attention. He said that somewhere in the Marval family's history, there was a belief that the one who carried life in her very breath would be the anchor that breaks the tide. Theo had nodded politely and thought it was the kind of thing sick old men said to comfort the people they were leaving behind. He hadn't thought about it again in 6 years. He was thinking about his chemistry notes when the classroom door opened at 7:52, and the world, for reasons he could not explain then or later, changed its texture entirely. She walked in ahead of the first bell, which meant she was early too, which meant she was probably nervous, though she didn't look it. She had curly brown hair that resisted the damp November air, honey-colored eyes that moved around the room quickly and with genuine curiosity, and a smile that appeared briefly when she found the room mostly empty, small and private, as though she'd been given an unexpected gift. She was wearing a light jacket entirely inappropriate for Oregon in November, and carrying a canvas tote bag covered in faded stickers from what appeared to be a dozen different cities. She carried herself the way people who have been to many new places carry themselves, with a practiced ease that was not the same as confidence but looked remarkably similar from the outside. And then she walked past Theo's desk. The scent reached him a full second before she passed. Jasmine, warm and impossibly green, something that belonged in summer rather than in this gray coastal morning. It hit him the way cold water hits someone who has been sitting too long in the same position. A full-body alert, an awakening that started somewhere deep in his chest and radiated outward before he could prepare for it. His heart, which had been beating in its slow, exhausted rhythm for months, lurched into something faster. Warmth moved through his hands. He gripped the edge of his desk. He recognized the feeling. Not the perfume. He had never smelled it before. But the sensation underneath it. The sudden, involuntary sense that something necessary had entered the room. His grandfather's words returned with a force that made no rational sense, and underneath the shock, beneath the unexpected warmth that flooded through him, there rose something else entirely. A cold, clear panic. Because Theo Marval knew, with the part of him that had spent 3 years learning the precise geography of his own limitations, exactly what it would mean to let someone matter to him now. He knew the cost. He had no intention of making anyone else pay it. She sat 2 rows away and introduced herself to the teacher as Isabella Moren, new transfer from Miami, Florida, and Theo spent the rest of the period staring at his book without reading a single word. The rest of Monday passed the way most school days passed in Ashford Creek, in a slow cadence of fluorescent light and rain against the windows. What was different was the low-level awareness Theo carried through every corridor, every class, every crowded moment between periods. The knowledge that Isabella Morin was somewhere in this building, and that he needed to ensure they remained as far from each other as the 3 hallways and 2 stairwells of Ashford Creek High would allow. He was good at distance. He had been practicing it for 3 years. It was not cruelty. That distinction mattered to him, though he suspected it wouldn't mean much to the people on the receiving end. He did not avoid Isabella because he thought poorly of her. He avoided her because sitting 2 rows away in first period and catching 3 seconds of her laugh when someone made a joke near the door had been enough to tell him that she was the kind of person who asked questions. He could see it in the way she moved through the room, not passively, the way new students usually cataloged exits and social hierarchies and safe corners, but actively, as though she was genuinely interested in how things worked and why. That quality, he knew, was dangerous for him. Curious people eventually turned their curiosity on whatever they couldn't quite figure out. And Theo had learned, over a long and sometimes painful semester, that he was something most people couldn't quite figure out. By Tuesday, Isabella had already made 2 friends. There was Priya Nkosi from AP Biology, who had an easy laugh and a talent for making anyone feel immediately welcome, and a quiet junior named Carter Ellison, who drew elaborate maps in the margins of his notebooks and seemed to collect interesting people the way others collected objects. Theo watched this from across the cafeteria with the detachment he genuinely felt, and a small, complicated something underneath it that he refused to examine. On Wednesday, she sat at the library table next to his. The library at Ashford Creek High was not large. 3 rows of shelving, a corner with armchairs that had seen better decades, and a bank of old desktop computers along the far wall that the librarian, Mr. Cassidy, kept alive through what appeared to be sheer personal willpower and a deep ideological commitment to the idea that not everything needed to be replaced. Theo used the library in the hour before first period, which was always empty, or had been, until Wednesday, when he arrived at 7:45 to find Isabella Morin cross-legged on one of the armchairs with a biology textbook open on her lap, and a thermos of what smelled like strong coffee balanced on the armrest. She looked up when he came in. She didn't look surprised to see him, or if she was, she didn't perform surprise the way people sometimes did when they wanted the other person to know they'd been noticed. She simply looked up, registered him, and nodded in a way that was entirely natural. "Morning," she said, and went back to her textbook. Theo sat at the table nearest the window, opened his chemistry notes, and spent the first 10 minutes aware of every small sound she made. The turn of a page, the quiet exhale of someone working through something difficult, the soft tap of her pen against the armrest when she paused to think. None of it was intrusive. That was almost the problem. It was simply present, comfortable, easy, as though she had been using this library at 7:45 every morning for years. He had managed to read 4 pages of notes when she spoke again. "Do you know if Mr. Cassidy keeps Oregon State Geological surveys?" she asked, not looking up from her textbook. "Anything from the last 10 years? My mom is looking for information about the Cedarwood Ridge soil composition, and the school library was the closest option, while the Institute's archives get organized." Theo paused. "Back shelf," he said. "3rd section from the left, organized by county." "Thank you." She unfolded from the chair with the easy grace of someone who had once been a dancer or had played a sport that required balance, went to the back shelf, found what she was looking for in under 2 minutes, and settled back into the armchair. "You come here every morning?" she asked. It wasn't small talk. He could tell the difference. "Yes," he said. Me too, I think, from now on. She paused and then, I'm Isabella, by the way. I don't think we've been properly introduced. We're in first period together. I know, he said. Theo. She nodded, as though that was sufficient, and returned to her reading. She didn't ask him anything else. She didn't try to fill the silence with conversation, or perform friendliness in the slightly exhausting way some people did. She simply occupied the same space with a quiet ease that Theo found, against every intention he had, genuinely difficult to maintain his defenses against, because it didn't feel like the beginning of something he could keep at arm's length. It felt, with a specificity that unsettled him, like something that had already arrived, and was simply waiting for him to acknowledge it. He left 2 minutes before the bell and told himself, walking down the corridor with cold linoleum under his boots and the heating system clanking overhead, that this was manageable, that he was in control, that the careful, bounded life he had built here would hold. He had become quite skilled at believing what he needed to believe in order to keep moving forward. He had been doing it for 3 years, and it had served him reasonably well. He was, he admitted privately, getting worse at it. Thursday brought a light dusting of snow, the first of the season, that settled over the pines like a held breath and made the town look for a few hours like a photograph from another era. Isabella was in the library again when he arrived. She had brought 2 coffees this time, and she set the spare one at the edge of the table nearest to him, without comment or ceremony, as though it were simply a practical thing to do when you knew someone else would be there. Theo stared at the cup for a long moment. Then he sat down and wrapped his cold hands around it, and something in his chest shifted slightly, like a lock that had been turned but not yet opened. He said, "Thank you." She said, of course. Neither of them said anything else for the next 40 minutes, and it was, by any measure, the most peaceful morning Theo Marvell had experienced in longer than he could honestly remember. The snow that had dusted Ashford Creek on Thursday deepened overnight, so that by Friday morning the town was buried in 6 inches of white silence, and the school parking lot had been plowed into mountains at each corner. The buses ran late. Half the faculty arrived in varying states of dishevelment. Mr. Cassidy, who walked 3 miles to school every morning regardless of weather, arrived precisely on time and made everyone else feel obscurely ashamed of themselves. Isabella was in the library before Theo for the first time that Friday, and she had pulled 2 armchairs next to the window that overlooked the back field, where the snow lay undisturbed all the way to the tree line. The pine trees at the edge of the field held their branches low under the weight of it, and the sky above them was the particular shade of white that meant more snow before noon. She looked up when he came in, and something in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, told him she'd known he'd be early. "It's better from the window," she said, tilting her head toward the field. "You can see the whole tree line." He put his bag down and sat in the second chair, and for a while neither of them said anything. There was something in the quality of the silence that morning that was different from the silences they'd shared the rest of the week, less careful, less maintained. The snow seemed to make the usual rules optional. "Your mom works at the Cedarwood Institute," Theo said eventually. It wasn't a question. He had heard it mentioned at school, the way anything unusual got mentioned in a town the size of Ashford Creek. "She does," Isabella said. "She's been working on research into rare cellular regenerative conditions, the kind that are genetic, progressive, and don't respond to standard treatments." She paused, looking out at the snow. They recruited her specifically because of some data they'd been collecting from families in the Pacific Northwest. "She doesn't tell me much, research confidentiality, but she seemed genuinely excited when they called. and she doesn't get genuinely excited very often. Theo was very still. She mentioned, Isabella continued in the same easy tone, that there are apparently a handful of families in this region that have been passing the same condition down for generations, and that the patterns are unlike anything in the existing literature. She thinks the regional environment might be a contributing factor to some of the symptom variations. The altitude, the mineral content in the groundwater, something. She glanced at him. Sorry. I grew up listening to her explain her research at the dinner table. It becomes a habit. Don't apologize, Theo said. His voice was even. He was working very hard to keep it that way. She turned to look at him then, properly, directly, and he got the sense that she was actually looking at him, not the version of him that most people saw and filed away under handsome and distant. You know what she's studying, she said. Not an accusation, just clarity. I know about the condition, he said carefully, in a general sense. Isabella held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and looked back at the snow, and she didn't push. And he understood from that single act of restraint that she was more perceptive than most people gave her credit for, and far more considerate than he had given her credit for. The silence between them reset itself into something warmer. Over the following 2 weeks, their mornings in the library became something both of them planned around without discussing. Isabella brought coffee every other day. Theo began saving her the window armchair. They talked, more than Theo had talked to anyone in a long time, about things that had no weight in them. The books they were reading, the geography of Miami versus Oregon, the particular social dynamics of a small school in a small town. Isabella was funny in a dry, unannounced way, the kind of funny that appeared in a single perfectly placed sentence and then vanished before you could be sure you'd heard it. Theo, who had forgotten he could be anything resembling amusing, found himself making her laugh twice on the same Tuesday morning and felt something so close to happiness that it frightened him. Because the wall was coming down, and he knew it, and he didn't know how to stop it without becoming someone he didn't want to be. He tried, once, on a Wednesday afternoon when they were both in the library after school. The building emptied out, and the heating humming steadily, and the darkness coming early as it did in November in the Northwest. He had looked up from his book and said, with more abruptness than he intended, that she should know he wasn't easy to be around, that people generally found it better to keep their distance. Isabella had considered this with the same directness she applied to everything. Why? She asked. He hadn't had an answer that wasn't the whole truth, and the whole truth was not something he was ready to give. It's complicated, he said. She put her bookmark carefully in her page and looked at him with the honey-colored eyes that missed very little. Most things worth understanding are, she said. That doesn't mean they're not worth the effort. And then she went back to her reading, and the subject closed without closing, in the way that some things do, when both people involved have agreed, without speaking, to give each other a little more time. Walking home through the snow that evening, with the pines black against the gray sky, and his breath misting in the cold air, Theo thought about the anchor that breaks the tide. He thought about his grandfather's voice, and the way the old man had said it as though he truly believed it. Not as comfort, but as information. He thought about Dr. Morin at the Cedarwood Institute, studying families like his in the data she'd collected from the Pacific Northwest. He thought about Isabella sitting in the lamplight with her book, the scent of jasmine faint in the cold air of an empty library. He walked the full 2 miles home in the dark and the snow, and he felt, despite everything, despite every reasonable argument he had rehearsed and believed, more alive than he had in 3 years. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. If this story is moving you, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter. We pour our hearts into every story. Your support means the world to us. What has been your favorite moment so far? Tell us in the comments. December arrived in Ashford Creek with the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. The river that ran behind Main Street froze along its edges. The school's boiler strained against temperatures that had no business visiting Oregon before Christmas. And Mr. Cassidy began wearing a second scarf indoors, which the students found oddly comforting. The pine forest beyond the school had gone very still, the way it did when the temperature dropped below a threshold that made even the wind reconsider its plans. Theo had a bad week the second week of December. Not catastrophically bad, not hospital bad, but the kind of bad that reminded him, as though he needed reminding, of the architecture of his situation. His hands were colder than usual. The fatigue that normally settled in by evening began arriving by early afternoon. On Wednesday, he sat in the library at his regular time and found that he didn't have the energy to read, which was new, and which he filed away with the same quiet efficiency. He filed everything, and he sat instead, watching the snow come down outside the window, with his hands wrapped around a thermos of tea his father had packed for him that morning. Isabella arrived at 7:50, shaking snow from her curls, and she looked at him once and sat down, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "When did you last sleep properly?" "I sleep fine," he said, which was mostly true. "That's not what I asked," she said. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that contained no pity. He would have closed down immediately at pity. But instead something quieter and more serious, the expression of someone who was paying attention and intended to continue doing so. "It's been a harder week," he said, which was more than he had said to anyone other than his father in 3 years. She nodded. She didn't press, but she also didn't pretend she hadn't noticed, which was its own form of respect, and which was why, later that same morning in the 5 minutes between first and second period, he found himself saying, with the abruptness of someone who has rehearsed a thing for so long that its unrehearsed version simply falls out of them, "I have a condition, a medical one. It's rare and it's genetic, and it runs in my family, and the doctors don't have a good answer for it yet." He said it standing at his locker, not looking at her, his jacket only half zipped because his fingers had been slow that morning. The hallway was loud around them. Isabella stood beside him and listened without interrupting. "It causes the kind of fatigue that doesn't go away," he continued, "and some other things. It's been getting worse." He paused. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to treat me differently. I'm telling you because you've been paying attention for weeks, and you deserve to not be working with incomplete information." "What's it called?" she asked, her voice steady. "The doctors are calling it Marval Regenerative Syndrome, after my family." He zipped his jacket. "My grandfather died of it, his brother before him." The hallway moved around them. Isabella was quiet for 5 full seconds, which was enough time for Theo to reconstruct every wall he had let down over the past 4 weeks, to remind himself of every reason he had given himself for why this was always going to end badly. And then she said quietly, "My mother is studying your family's condition." He turned to look at her. "She told me last night," Isabella said. "She didn't use your name, obviously, patient confidentiality, but she described it. Progressive, genetic, multi-generational in regional families. She's been looking at it for 4 months. She met his eyes. Theo, she thinks she found something. She's been cautious because she always is. She won't claim anything she hasn't tested 3 times. But she came home 2 weeks ago and made pasta from scratch, which she only does when something has genuinely gone right. The noise of the hallway became very distant. She has a lead, Isabella continued. A protein synthesis pathway that's been overlooked in previous research, because it doesn't show up in standard panels. She's been working with the Cedarwood team and 2 other researchers she brought in from Seattle. She held his gaze, and her voice didn't waver. I'm not telling you it's a cure. I don't know enough to tell you that. I'm telling you that my mother doesn't make pasta from scratch for nothing. Theo stood at his locker for a long moment. He felt something that he had carefully not felt in 3 years, because feeling it required a kind of courage that was harder, he had discovered, than the resigned peace he had made with the alternative. He felt hope. It came in quietly, the way light comes in through a gap that has always been there, but that you have been sitting with your back to. She'd want to talk to you, Isabella said. To your dad, properly. Not because she knows it's you, she doesn't, but because she's been trying to reach the families in her study who are currently symptomatic, and she keeps hitting dead ends. She paused. I can tell her you exist without telling her it's you. Or you can tell me to stay out of it entirely, and I will never mention it again. It's yours to decide. Theo looked at her, this girl from Miami, who had arrived in his fog-wrapped town like summer through the wrong door, who had sat beside him in a cold library for weeks, who brought coffee on alternating mornings without making it mean anything pressuring, who had looked at him just now without pity, without drama, without the slightly exhausting tenderness of someone who pitied a person's situation, but with the clear-eyed steadiness of someone who simply saw him and thought the situation worth addressing. Tell her, he said, and his voice was steadier than he expected it to be. The bell rang. They walked to their separate classes. Theo sat through second-period physics, with his hands folded on his desk, and the heating unit rattling steadily below the window, and the snow falling outside, and he thought quietly and carefully, and that perhaps his grandfather had been telling him something true all along, and that it had never been about anything extraordinary. It had been about the simple, radical act of letting someone in. The meeting with Dr. Sophia Morin happened on a Thursday evening in the second week of December, in the Marval family's living room, with snow falling outside the bay window, and a fire going in the fireplace that Theo's father, Daniel, had built with the focused energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Daniel Marval was 52, broad-shouldered, with the same gray eyes as his son, and the kind of quietness that came from having been afraid for a long time, and having found, in that fear, a kind of dignity. He shook Dr. Morin's hand at the door, and thanked her for coming, and his voice only broke a little on the last word. Dr. Sophia Morin was not what Theo had expected, which made him realize that he had, despite himself, constructed an expectation. She was small and precise, with Isabella's honey-brown eyes, and a manner that was both warm and exact, the way people are when they have spent years learning to communicate complex things to frightened people, without diminishing either the complexity or the person. She had brought a folder of research summaries printed on plain paper, because she had learned, she said, that printed pages were easier for people to hold on to than screens when their hands were nervous. Isabella had come with her, and she sat beside Theo on the couch while their parents settled across the coffee table, and she didn't hold his hand. That would have been too much, and she seemed to understand what was too much. But she sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and that particular kind of proximity, quiet and warm and entirely without performance, was enough. Dr. Morin explained her research with the same clarity and consideration she apparently brought to everything. The protein synthesis pathway she had identified, designated PS14 in her lab's internal notation, had been overlooked in previous research because it only appeared in specific genetic markers that weren't part of standard screening. She had found it by cross-referencing 3 generations of health records from 4 Pacific Northwest families, all showing the same progressive pattern. The preliminary trials, conducted in a controlled research environment with appropriate oversight, had shown that targeted PS14 therapy could, in early indications, not only slow the progression of the syndrome, but potentially support the body's own regenerative processes in beginning to repair what had been damaged. She was careful with her language. She used words like preliminary and early indications, and promising rather than words like cure or certain or fixed. She looked at both Theo and his father when she spoke, rotating her attention between them with the practiced equity of someone who understood that they were both, in different ways, the patient here. And when she had finished laying out the research, she set the folder on the coffee table and said, quietly, that she would like, with their consent, and through the proper medical channels, and with the full involvement of their existing care team, to include Theo in the next phase of her study. Daniel Marval looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he looked at the fire. Then, very carefully, he pressed the back of his hand to his eyes, and the room held still around him while he did. "Dad," Theo said softly. "I'm fine," Daniel said and cleared his throat and straightened. "I'm fine. Yes. We'd like that very much. Thank you." He looked at Dr. Morin, and the gratitude in his face was the kind that had no adequate expression, and so settled for just being entirely visible. "Thank you." The weeks that followed were not simple. Theo would be the first to say that hope, when you have been living without it for long enough, is not a comfortable sensation. It is almost, in the early days, harder than the alternative, because it requires you to want something again, and wanting is a thing that makes you vulnerable in ways that resignation does not. He went to the Cedarwood Institute for his first assessment in the 3rd week of December. He sat in a white room with efficient fluorescent lights and answered questions, and gave blood, and endured the precise, unhurried attention of Dr. Morin's team, and on the drive home, his father talked the whole way without really saying anything, which was how Daniel Marval expressed that he was too full of feeling to organize it. Isabella was waiting on the Marval porch when they got back, sitting on the top step with a thermos of coffee and her winter coat, watching the street with the patient ease of someone who was comfortable waiting because she knew what she was waiting for. She stood up when the car pulled in, and she looked at Theo as he came up the path, and she didn't ask how it went, because she could read the answer in his face. "The coffee's still hot," she said. He sat down on the step beside her. She handed him the thermos. The street was quiet and snow-covered, and the pine trees at the end of the block were dark against the last pale strip of winter sky. And from inside the house came the sound of his father on the phone, his voice different than it had been in years. Higher, lighter, the voice of someone who had been given something back. "My grandfather told me," Theo said after a while, "that the anchor that breaks the tide would come in her own time." Isabella looked at him sideways. "Your grandfather sounds dramatic." "He was," Theo said. "He was also, as it turns out, right about most things." She was quiet for a moment. The cold settled around them like a blanket, the particular intimacy of very cold, very still air. "I came to Ashford Creek because my mom got a job," she said. "I didn't want to move. I was angry about it for almost the entire drive up I-5. She paused. I'm not angry anymore. Theo looked at her. Her curls were escaping from under her knit hat. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She was looking at the snow on the street with a small, private smile. The same one she'd had, he realized. The first morning she walked into an empty classroom and found it unexpectedly peaceful. He thought about how close he had come to building a wall so solid that she would have given up and looked away. He thought about all the mornings he might have sat in a library alone and called it sufficient. I'm glad you're not angry anymore, he said. She turned to look at him then. And in the last light of a December afternoon in a small Oregon town, wrapped in snow and pine-scented cold, something passed between them that needed no translation. He reached out, slowly, and tucked a curl back under the edge of her hat. His hand was warmer than it had been in months, genuinely warmer, from the inside out, from the particular warmth of a life that had remembered, in the company of the right person, that it intended to keep going. She leaned her head very lightly against his shoulder. The pines stood still. The snow held. The town went on around them in its quiet, fog-wrapped way, carrying its generations of stories in the dark beneath the frost. And among those stories now, there was this one. A boy who had been running out of time and a girl who had arrived, entirely by ordinary accident, to give it back to him. Not through anything impossible, not through anything that defied the careful logic of the world, but through the unremarkable, radical, ancient act of two people choosing to see each other clearly, and then choosing, without apology, to stay. The coffee was still warm. The sky deepened above the pines. Inside the house, Daniel Marval was telling Theo's Aunt Elena that something had changed, and his voice was the voice of someone speaking from the other side of a very long winter. It was, in every way that mattered, the beginning of spring. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. It's the greatest way to show your support and ensure more stories like this one come your way. And tell us in the comments, which was your favorite moment from this story? Was it the library mornings, the pasta that meant hope, or the last moment on the porch? We read every single comment. Thank you for being here.